I grew up in Haven 9, an intricate subterranean city engineered for survival. But as a maintenance engineer, I was the first to see the impossible truth. The structural collapse of our 2-century-old sanctuary was imminent. When my superiors dismissed the hard data, calling it panic, I escaped the city's destruction alone in the frantic final moments, emerging onto the forbidden surface not to find the expected nuclear wasteland, but a world stunningly, violently alive, with immediate beauty and profound danger. In that brutal, exhilarating new environment, where every moment signaled life or death, I found a different kind of strength, forging not only a path to survival but also an unexpected and powerful love, beginning a fierce new life beyond the limits of technology. Chapter 1. The Cracking World. The air in Maintenance Tunnel M7 tasted like ozone, stale sweat, and the fine, metallic dust of slow decay. It was a flavor Aria Lorne had known since childhood, the signature scent of Haven 9, the subterranean mausoleum that held the last of human civilization. Aria wasn't sentimental about the smell or the place. To her, Haven 9 was a machine, and the machine was failing. A flicker of light from her shoulder-mounted utility lamp danced across the floor, illuminating the polished, obsidian surface of the primary structural support column. Aria, clad in reinforced coveralls that dwarfed her slight wire-taut frame, knelt, running a gloved hand along the cold steel base. Her primary concern wasn't the column itself, but the concrete grout surrounding it. She was not a large woman, a consequence of generations living under a low-gravity, strictly rationed regime, but every movement was efficient, driven by the sharp, focused mind behind her dark, tightly braided hair. When she lifted her head, the concentrated beam of her headlamp caught the intensity of her piercing, ice-blue gaze, eyes that seemed to absorb the dim light and reflect it back as pure analysis. They were beautiful eyes, certainly, but in the gloom of M7, they looked only practical, fixed on the measurement gauge in her hand. M7. Column Delta 9 Sigma. Ambient humidity, 78%. Pressure variance. 3 standard deviations above expected norm for this time cycle, she muttered into the comm unit clipped to her collar, the voice quiet but crisp, cutting through the low, pervasive thrum of the city's life support systems. But the numbers were irrelevant compared to the site. It had been widening for 3 shifts, but now it was unmistakable. A crack, thin as thread yesterday, now yawned nearly 2 millimeters wide, running from the base of the column horizontally into the floor plate. It wasn't the size that alarmed her, it was the texture, uneven, fractured, like a deep, sudden cut in old scar tissue. This wasn't settling. This was a tear. She pressed a specialized acoustic sensor against the steel. The sound that returned through the heavy, insulated headset was a low, guttural grinding. The earth moving, the mountain above them settling its impossible weight onto the dome. It was the sound of a scream, muffled by miles of granite. Aria sat back on her heels, a tremor running not through the floor, but through her own body. For 200 years, Haven 9 had promised sanctuary, a perfectly engineered bubble against the ash-scarred surface. But an engineer understands decay. She understood that logic and design could only hold back chaos for so long. She had been warning the Council of Preservation for months that the geological survey models were outdated, that the tremors were increasing exponentially, that the city was no longer resting on the stone but fighting with it. Now she had proof. "This is not a repair job," she whispered, pulling the comm unit closer. "This is a terminal diagnosis." Conflict with authority. The lift ride up from the maintenance levels to the executive tier was a study in contrasts. The lower depths were grit and rust, exposed conduits, and the hurried footfalls of laborers and mechanics. The executive tier was pristine white polymer, polished synthwood accents, and the silent, antiseptic air of true power. The ascent felt less like a journey, and more like a translation between 2 separate worlds. Aria felt the unfamiliar tightness of the pressed gray uniform she wore for council meetings, a futile attempt to look less like a tunnel rat and more like a peer. She clutched the data slate, which contained the acoustic readings, stress fractures, and geological models, proof stacked upon proof. Administrator Theron of the Council of Preservation occupied an office designed to convey unshakable stability. Behind his polished desk, the wall was not steel or rock, but a high-definition simulation of a clear blue sky, a window to a world none of them had ever truly seen. Theron himself was a man whose entire personality was built around quiet, unwavering confidence, which Aria knew was a fragile facade maintained by carefully curated data and rigid denial. "Aria, thank you for coming up so promptly," Theron said, not looking up from a paper report, a strange, archaic formality they still insisted on for critical documents. He did not invite her to sit. "Administrator, I bypassed the normal reporting channels because this cannot wait for the weekly review," Aria stated, placing the data slate on his desk. The gray composite material of the slate looked stark and utilitarian against the smooth faux sherry wood. I have primary acoustic and strain readings from M7 and M8. The deep structural support columns are failing. The failure isn't material fatigue, it's geological. The mountain is shifting faster than the damping field can compensate. Theron sighed, a practiced sound of professional weariness, and finally looked up. His eyes, though lacking Aria's intensity, held the flat, dismissive authority of a man who believed the greatest threat to his city was panic, not collapse. Aria, we appreciate your diligence, but your terminology is hyperbolic. Failing? We are an engineered marvel. We absorb stress. That is what we are designed to do. Please don't confuse routine maintenance issues with existential threats. Sir, the differential stress across Delta-9 is exceeding the tolerance margin by 1.8% and accelerating. The acoustic profile is generating harmonics consistent with microfissures in the bedrock itself. This is not routine, Aria countered, her voice rising slightly. She tapped the slate, forcing the main stress diagram to flash across Theron's desktop screen, a horrific spiderweb of red and orange lines spreading outward from the deep structure. Theron glanced at the diagram, barely registering the visual data. And what is the structural solution? More grout? Another layer of synth steel reinforcement? The structural solution is irrelevant. We can patch this column, but another one will fail. And another. We can't reinforce the entire mountain. We need to initiate the surface evacuation protocols. Not a panic drill, but a controlled, phased ascent. We need to open the airlocks and prepare to live above ground, before the reactor failure risk collapses the entire dome. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the gentle hum of the simulated blue sky behind Theron. Evacuation? Theron finally said, the word dripping with utter contempt. Aria, you are an excellent engineer. Your talent with maintenance systems is unrivaled. But you do not understand governing. The moment we mention surface, we lose control. The moment we introduce the variable of panic, all of HAVEN9 ends. Our survival is predicated on order. He picked up the data slate and slid it back across the desk toward her. I will authorize a triple-load grout injection into M7, and you will oversee the installation of new dampening anchors in M8. You will adjust your geological model to account for a long-term settling trend. You will file this report under low-priority structural deviance, and you will speak of this to no one outside of this room. Aria stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin, furious line. You are choosing to lie to 40,000 people to maintain your sense of control. I am choosing to ensure 40,000 people wake up tomorrow in a city that functions, Theron corrected, leaning forward, his tone hardening with finality. This city was built on the principle of logic, and the logical conclusion is that to survive, we must remain exactly where we are, under control. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual high-priority resource allocation reports to approve. Aria did not argue. She knew when a debate was truly over. She simply retrieved the data slate, tucked it under her arm, and turned to leave. As the heavy, polished synth door sealed behind her, Aria felt the despair of being utterly alone in her knowledge. The council wasn't malicious, they were merely blinded by their own dogma, that their perfect subterranean system was untouchable. They believed that if they simply refused to look up, the roof wouldn't fall. Family and frustration. Aria returned to her small family module on the D-Wing residential tier. Unlike the executive tier's sterile perfection, the D-Wing was cramped and humming with the noise of ordinary life, the distant echo of synth music, the smell of recycled cooking oil, and the muffled arguments of neighbors. Her mother, Mara Lorne, was sitting at the small synth fiber table, slowly stitching a frayed seam on one of Lyra's older shirts. Mara was frail, her skin pale from the perpetual absence of true sunlight, but her presence radiated a quiet, enduring strength. You're early, dear, Mara said, not looking up, her voice a soft counterpoint to the city's endless mechanical drone. How was the meeting with the suits? Aria tossed her data slate onto the counter with a metallic clang and peeled off her coveralls, her movements sharp with residual frustration. Predictable. They approved a triple-load grout injection and filed my report under structural variance. They called my findings hyperbolic. Mara paused her stitching, her eyes, the same shade of blue as Aria's but softer, warmer, lifting to meet her daughter's. Ah, the preservationists. Maintaining their perfect illusion. Did you expect anything else? They've been ignoring the tremors for years. I expected them to at least look at the acoustic scans, Mother. That mountain is grinding against the dome. We have weeks, maybe a month, before the strain on the primary reactor conduit becomes terminal. That's not rhetoric, it's physics. Just then, Lyra tumbled into the room from the small attached sleeping alcove, holding a tattered ancient book, a physical book, a forbidden treasure Aria had salvaged from the restricted archives. Lyra, at 16, was all limbs and vibrant, restless energy, a stark contrast to Aria's contained precision and Mara's gentle weariness. Lyra was one of the few who still possessed true optimism, a strange innocence maintained by her sister's protection. "Aria, look! I found a passage!" Lyra exclaimed, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "It's from the Journal of the First Colonists. They talk about the surface. They called it the Green." Aria sighed, but the tension in her jaw eased fractionally at the sight of her sister. "Lyra, put the book away. Those journals are heavily biased, written by people who wanted to escape the collapse, not people who had to survive it." "But they talk about the trees," Lyra insisted, flipping to a page with a crudely drawn sketch of a massive, branching organism. "And the sky, a limitless expanse of blue, unmarred by ash. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Like a painting you can breathe?" "It sounds like a radiation hazard wrapped in wishful thinking," Aria said, grabbing a protein bar from the dispenser. "The surface is sterile, deadly, or run by savages, depending on which official report you read." "That book is a fairy tale, Lyra. Maybe the officials are the ones telling the lies, not the book," Lyra challenged, her blue eyes wide and earnest. "You're the one always telling us to question the data. What if Haven 9 is the lie, and the green is the truth?" Mara gently intervened, touching Lyra's arm. "Darling, your sister is tired, and she's right. We rely on engineering here, not poetry." Aria looked at her mother, feeling a wave of guilt. Mara was dependent on the city's meticulously controlled environment, the stable air, the filtered water, the regulated temperature, to manage her chronic respiratory weakness. The surface, whatever its state, was a death sentence for her. And yet, staying here was a delayed one. "I'm sorry, Lyra," Aria said, leaning down to kiss her sister's head. "I'm just frustrated. I have the solution, but they refuse to acknowledge the problem. I'll run the diagnostic again tonight, see if I can't find a model that proves my case using their own parameters." Aria knew it was futile. There was no model that could convince a man like Theron to willingly dismantle his ordered world. She finished her meal in silence, the internal clock of the city ticking relentlessly toward inevitable disaster. Later, as she lay on her own cot, staring at the dim, recessed light of their ceiling panel, Aria thought about the widening crack in M7. She thought about the acoustic profile, the way the deep earth seemed to be swallowing their safe harbor. She thought about Mara's frail lungs and Lyra's hopeful, innocent eyes. Logic had failed. The perfect machine of Haven 9 was broken, and its custodians refused the necessary repairs. A cold, hard resolve began to form in Aria's mind. If they won't fix the city, she thought, then I will save my family from it. Inciting incident, the reactor collapse. The sound began as a low, structural groan, a sound so deep and resonant that it didn't travel through the air, but through the bone. It was the sound of 1,000 tons of steel and granite screaming in unison. Aria was in the middle of a sleep cycle, a deep, necessary rest before her next 12-hour shift when the city lurched. Not a tremor, which was a quick, sharp shake, but a wrenching, lateral shift. The recessed lights in their compartment exploded into blinding emergency red, pulsing rapidly. The entire module rattled violently, throwing objects off shelves and making the heavy synthwood doors shudder. Alarm status, code red, core sector 3 integrity breach. Lockdown initiated. The digitized voice of the central computer, normally calm and even, was now a shrill, distorted shriek coming from the public address speakers. "Aria!" Mara cried out, struggling to sit up on her bed, clutching her chest. "What was that?" "Reactor section Gamma," Aria instantly identified, already on her feet. Her training was immediate, overriding the shock. Gamma is directly above M7. The structural shear must have compromised the primary coolant conduits. She yanked her coveralls on over her thin sleepwear, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Lyra was awake now, silent, clutching her mother's hand, her face white with fear. "Stay here. Stay calm. I have to go to my station. I can access the emergency diagnostics remotely and see the full extent," Aria said, though her engineering instincts were already screaming at her. "Don't go toward the core." She grabbed her utility belt and threw open the door. The corridor was chaos. Citizens, jolted awake by the catastrophic sound, were streaming out of their modules, panicking. The emergency red lights cast terrifying, flickering shadows. The usual antiseptic smell of the tier was now tainted by a hot, sickening scent, burning oil, vaporized coolant, and ozone. A man stumbled past her, his face smeared with dust, screaming about the lights dying on the level above. Aria fought her way against the flow, running toward her maintenance access terminal. When she reached it, she slammed her data slate into the cradle and input her authorization code. The screen flashed, but the data feed was fragmented, choked with errors. Error. Core sector 3 to 98% systems offline. Structural integrity nominal at 42%. Casualties confirmed. Containment field compromised. Reactor power output dropping exponentially. Estimated structural failure of entire sector in T-1 hour. 42% structural integrity. That was essentially zero. A tremor, not a major shift, but a sharp, deep reverberation, shook the console, and then the lights failed completely on this level. The red emergency lights went dead. Total, crushing darkness. The sound of the crowd immediately changed. The screams turned into an animal roar of sheer terror. People were pushing, stumbling, their fear magnified by the sudden blindness. Aria, whose eyes were better adjusted to the deep gloom of the lower tunnels, used the flashlight on her belt to illuminate the escape routes, but her mind was racing past her job. The reactor collapse wasn't the problem, it was the evidence. This collapse confirmed everything Theron had denied. The mountain was winning, and the city's life support heart was exposed and dying. This was not a system error she could fix with a wrench and a synth patch. This was the end of HAVEN 9. She pulled the data slate out of the console, the terminal already sparking and dying. She didn't run back to her module. She fought her way through the panicked crowd toward the nearest junction shaft. Aria, the meticulous planner, the one who believed in logic above all else, was abandoning protocol. She was running on a pure primal need, family. The turning point, a terminal diagnosis. The journey back to the residential module felt like swimming against a toxic current. The air was becoming heavier, warmer, and filled with a visible, thick haze of dust and smoke filtering down from the upper core levels. When she finally reached her door, she found Lyra struggling to help Mara pull on a pair of thermal boots. Mara was struggling to breathe, her shallow gasps audible, even over the chaos outside. "We need to go now," Aria said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, operating on pure adrenaline. She grabbed a small, pre-packed survival satchel, a bag she had prepared and hidden months ago, a private admission of her fears, stocked with purified water tablets, compressed food, and a multiband radio. "Go where, Aria?" The lockdown signal said to shelter in place. Mara pleaded, her eyes wide. "The lockdown signal is a lie. The integrity of Core Sector 3 is at 42%. That means the entire containment dome above it could breach, and the rest will follow. Haven 9 is dying, Mother. It's not just a part of it. The mountain is crushing us. But the surface? We can't survive on the surface," Mara insisted, tears starting to trace clean paths down her dusty cheeks. "I won't make it a day." A heavy, sickening thump echoed from above, closer this time, followed by the grinding sound of stressed metal. The floor vibrated beneath their feet. Aria looked at her mother, then at Lyra, who was staring at her with desperate, unquestioning trust. "We won't survive an hour here, Mara," Aria said, her voice soft but absolute. She didn't have time for a sentimental farewell or a debate. This is not a choice between safe and dangerous. It is a choice between a calculated risk and a guarantee of death. We take the risk. She moved with an engineer's brutal efficiency. She strapped the satchel onto Lyra, ensuring the weight was balanced. She took Mara's arm. "We're not going up to the main airlocks, where Theron will have his guards. We're going through the maintenance tunnels, down, and then laterally toward the abandoned water reclamation sector. It still has an access shaft that goes straight to the outer boundary wall, and I know the decommission codes." Lyra held tight to Aria's arm. "The water tunnels? Are those stable?" "No," Aria admitted honestly, pulling them out the door. "But they're empty, and they're not monitored. We need darkness and silence." They moved against the panicked tide. Aria's small stature, often a perceived weakness in the underground's hierarchy, was now a critical advantage. She was narrow, able to slip through gaps and around the stumbling figures of larger, heavier men. Her movements were always forward. As they reached the junction leading to the deep maintenance shaft, a final, catastrophic event occurred. A blinding, blue-white light flared at the end of the main residential corridor, followed by a shockwave that hit them like a physical blow. The heat was instantaneous and terrible. The sound was a deafening roar, not the groan of metal, but the sound of rock turning to dust. The overhead ceiling above the main corridor, the primary support for the entire executive tier, had buckled and failed. The blast of toxic air and dust was enough to throw Aria and Lyra against the opposite wall. Aria shielded her sister with her body, coughing violently, the air filter mask she kept on her belt now priceless. "Mother!" Lyra screamed. Mara had been a step behind them. The force of the collapse had struck the wall where she had been standing. A secondary panel, blown outward by the sheer pressure, had slammed into her chest. Aria scrambled to her, her lamp beam cutting through the thick, choking cloud of dust. Mara was slumped against the wall, her breathing ragged, a dark smear of blood blooming across her frail uniform. Her eyes were still open, fixed on Aria. "Go," Mara rasped, the word barely a whisper, a spray of blood bubbling at her lips. "Go, Aria. Take Lyra. Go. You have to." Aria felt the world slow. All the data, all the planning, all the logic. It collapsed into a single, terrifying point of agonizing grief. Her mother, the anchor, the one person she had sworn to save above all else, was dying, not with a heroic sacrifice, but with a brutal, random twist of broken metal. Aria reached out, touching her mother's cooling cheek. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "No," Mara whispered, shaking her head fractionally. "Not sorry. Live. Build." And then, her gentle, warm blue eyes clouded over, fixed on the red, distorted emergency light that still pulsed fitfully down the corridor. A torrent of panic, of guilt, of paralyzing despair, threatened to consume Aria. This was the failure she couldn't fix with logic. This was the chaos that proved her systems were meaningless. But Lyra was tugging on her arm, her face soaked with tears, her breath coming in ragged, horrified gasps. "Aria, we have to go. Please, the smoke is getting thicker." Aria tore her gaze away from Mara. The sight of Lyra, the innocent hope, the absolute trust, was a physical punch that snapped Aria back to her function. She wasn't just a daughter, she was a sister, a protector, an engineer of survival. She leaned down, gave her mother one last, quick kiss on the forehead, and forced herself to stand. She did not look back. She could not. "Lyra, we go now. And we don't stop, not for anything," Aria commanded, her voice raw, stripped of its mechanical precision, now laced with steel. She pulled her sister away from the devastation and into the relative quiet of the deep maintenance access shaft. Aria climbed down the metal rung ladder, the dust stinging her eyes, the sound of the collapsing city muffled by the layers of steel above them. She was heading down, into the darkness, to find the airlock that would lead them up, toward the terrifying, unknown light of the surface. Her final report to the council had been rejected, but now, her only priority was self-evacuation. She reached the first landing. She looked up at the circle of red emergency light visible above them. That light was not a beacon. It was a warning. "Theron dismissed my data. He sentenced us all. I will not be sentenced." Aria gripped the aluminum rungs, her knuckles white. Her logic-driven brain, now fused with pure, survivor's grief, began calculating the final, dangerous descent. The maintenance shaft M12. The decommissioned water reclamation sector. The outer wall airlock. The surface coordinates. She was done trying to fix the old world. She was going to find a new one. "We move," she whispered to Lyra, the promise of survival cutting through the haze of smoke and sorrow. Chapter 2. Descent into Chaos. The silence after the main collapse was almost more terrifying than the noise. It wasn't a true silence, but the vast, smothering quiet of a machine dying, the thrum of the emergency air filtration units struggling, the distant, distorted shrieks of the panicked still echoing from the main corridors above, and the wet, hollow drip of escaping coolant somewhere nearby. Aria descended the ladder of maintenance shaft M12, with the practiced ease of someone who treated gravity as a variable to be managed, not an absolute. Her slight, petite frame was an advantage here, allowing her to move quickly and quietly through the tight, dusty space. Lyra, her younger sister Hri, followed close behind, guided only by the small, tightly focused beam of Aria's utility lamp, and the absolute certainty that her older sister was their only anchor. The air in the shaft quickly became noxious, a thick cocktail of pulverized rock, hot metal vapor, and the oily smoke of burning synth polymers. Aria had to pause every few rungs to ensure Lyra adjusted the fit of her repurposed respirator mask. "Breathe slow, Lyra. Filter the fear," Aria instructed, her voice a low, steady rumble through the static of her own mask. Lyra, her face streaked with dust and tears, nodded silently. Her usual vibrant optimism was shuttered, replaced by a rigid, shell-shocked obedience. The brutal, random death of their mother, Mara, only minutes ago, had severed her tie to the world they knew. Now Aria was the only reality left. "The ladder ends here," Aria announced, reaching the bottom of the long, dizzying drop. They were in a small, cramped transfer junction. Ahead, a heavy, circular vault door marked Water Reclamation Sector, decommissioned. The metal was rusted a deep, ochre brown, and the pneumatic locking system had been offline for decades. Aria pulled a specialized, multi-spectrum cutting tool from her utility belt. She didn't bother trying to override the lock. She bypassed it entirely. Direct access. She worked with a frightening, intense focus. Her piercing blue eyes were narrowed in concentration, reflecting the blue-hot pinprick of her plasma torch as she meticulously cut the sheer pins of the massive door. The smell of burning steel briefly overpowered the smoke, a small, contained act of destruction necessary for their salvation. Thump whine, Kirsch. The door groaned inward with the sound of metal protesting a long-forgotten wound. A sudden rush of air, colder and damper, flowed out from the darkness beyond, the breath of the abandoned reclamation tunnels. "After you, Lyra." Keep the lamp low. No noise, Aria commanded, slipping into the black space. Leadership and followers. The water reclamation sector was a subterranean cathedral of neglect. It was miles of concrete and curved, corrugated steel walls, damp and echoing. The floor was slick with condensation, and pools of stagnant black water reflected the low beam of Aria's lamp like broken mirrors. They had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes, navigating by the faded, archaic symbols on the walls and the precise map stored in Aria's eidetic memory. The tunnels were a maze, but Aria knew every forgotten detour, every sealed maintenance hatch, the forgotten back alleys of Haven 9, where the real work was done and hidden. They were passing a junction where 3 large corroded pipes met, when Lyra stopped abruptly, her hand clamping onto Aria's arm with startling strength. Aria, wait. Listen. Aria froze, killing her lamp. She held her breath, straining to hear over the distant, metallic sigh of the city's slow structural failure. Faintly, tentatively, she heard it. Footsteps. Not the assured, quick step of an engineer, but the stumbling, hesitant shuffle of multiple people, moving quickly but without direction. A wave of tension, cold and sharp, washed over her. Security patrol? No, they wouldn't risk the decommissioned zone. She angled her beam just barely enough to illuminate the curved wall of the tunnel behind them. The light caught them. A small, desperate group of 5 figures, huddled together, their faces pale masks of fear in the dust-filled air. They were not guards. They were survivors. A maintenance worker named Roland, a burly man who worked the hydraulic lifts, a nervous, young systems analyst with his wife, who clutched a screaming infant, and an elderly couple from the lower residential tier. They had seen Aria's light and followed it, like moths drawn to the only flicker of purpose in the overwhelming dark. Roland, the maintenance man, recognized Aria immediately, despite the mask and the gloom. Aria Lorne. Engineer Lorne. Thank the dome. We saw you heading for M12. Is there a way out? They said the airlocks are locked down. Aria stepped fully into the small, faint glow of her lamp, her silhouette sharp and utterly composed. She did not offer false comfort. The main airlocks will be sealed and guarded by Preservation Council security. The main core is collapsing. In under an hour, the structural integrity of this half of the city will be nominal 0. You need to leave Haven 9 now. The systems analyst's wife, her face frantic, shook her head violently. The surface? That's suicide. It's toxic. The elders said the filtration systems failed generations ago. The elders were lying to prevent panic, Aria countered, her voice ringing with hard authority. I have reviewed the atmospheric scans from the last probe. The air is breathable. The surface is habitable. If you stay here, you die. I am going to the decommissioned outer seal hatch, M19. It leads out. I will not stop or slow down. If you want to live, you follow my exact instructions. She didn't ask for consent. She offered a stark choice, a line drawn in the darkness. Roland, the hydraulics man, looked at the weeping couple, then back at Aria's unflinching blue gaze. He was a man accustomed to trusting machinery and direct orders. In the absence of a machine, he chose the only logical working mechanism left, Aria's mind. We follow you, Engineer Lorne, Roland said, hoisting his own small satchel higher on his shoulder. Just tell us where to put our feet. Aria nodded once, the acknowledgement of a compact sealed in fear. She had not asked to lead, but she would not refuse the burden. It was simply another system she was forced to maintain. Lyra, stay exactly 2 steps behind me. Roland, you take the rear. Everyone else, keep your body weight low, move silently, and do not use personal lights. We need to be ghosts, and with that, Aria Lorne, the maintenance engineer, became the accidental leader of a ragged, desperate exodus. The narrow corridor and the emotional weight. The pace Aria set was brutal. A forced, non-stop march through twisting, often partially flooded tunnels. Her goal was the outer boundary wall, miles away, and every minute they spent under the collapsing dome was borrowed time. She moved with an almost mechanical precision, avoiding the obvious paths, instead navigating through sections of the complex that were only marked on deep-level schematics, narrow conduits, vertical transfer shafts, and pressurized sluice gates. Her logic was simple. Complexity equals safety. The less obvious the route, the less likely they were to encounter patrolling security or other, more chaotic groups of citizens. The emotional tension of the group was palpable, thick enough to choke on, even without the dust. The young mother's quiet weeping was incessant, the infant a constant, muffled whimper. The elderly man stumbled frequently, his breath ragged. Aria felt every single weakness, every moment of despair, but she didn't allow herself to react. Her grief over Mara was walled off, locked behind a mental shield, a pragmatic measure to ensure her own functional survival. She had to be the system, because the city system had failed. It was in a particularly tight vertical transfer shaft, where they had to pull themselves up 3 stories using rusted chains and crumbling footholds, that the weight of her sister's sorrow finally broke through her defenses. They paused briefly at the top landing. Lyra slumped against the damp wall, her head in her hands. "I can't believe it, Aria," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking. "I keep thinking, she should be here. If we hadn't gone that way, if we'd just stayed in the module." "Stop." Aria's voice was sharp, cutting through the self-recrimination. She forced Lyra's chin up until their eyes met in the gloom. "Lyra, listen to me. This is not her fault, and it is not yours. It was a random event. It was a structural failure that hit the wall she was nearest to. It was chance, and bad engineering. If we had stayed in the module, the core collapse would have vaporized us all. We would be ash. She made sure we lived. Don't you ever cheapen that by calling it guilt or a choice?" It was the only way Aria could process the death, through logic, through the engineer's clear-eyed assignment of cause and effect. She couldn't afford the messy, debilitating weight of sorrow, but she was so frail. And the surface. Lyra trailed off, her fear of the unknown a greater weight than the imminent threat of the underground. "The surface is life, Lyra. It is air, clean water, and a chance. If we survive this journey, we will survive what's out there. We will do it for her, and we will do it together. Do you understand? We only move forward." Aria let the command settle, using the strength of her will to steady her sister. It was a necessary moment of forced catharsis, a painful reset. Lyra took a shuddering breath, wiped the tears and dust from her eyes, and nodded, the hope that Mara had fostered in her flickering back to life. "Yes, Aria, forward. Breakthrough. The wall and the last chance." They had to cross a vast, subterranean reservoir, now mostly empty, but still slick with a deep, fetid layer of algae and residual chemical sludge. The only path was a narrow, corroded catwalk, spanning the sheer drop pit. As they moved across the catwalk, the entire structure of the city let out one final, massive creak. It was the sound of metal shearing completely, of tons of concrete falling. A shockwave tore through the reservoir, sending echoes rattling off the curved walls. The power grid, which had been tenuously holding on, finally gave up the ghost. Absolute darkness. The sudden, total cessation of the city's hum. Haven 9, for the first time in 2 centuries, was truly silent. Roland cursed, stumbling against the rail. The young mother cried out, almost dropping the baby. "Lamps on. Low beam," Aria yelled, her voice echoing in the dead silence. The sudden, focused light beams from their utility lamps created terrifying, isolated bubbles in the vast blackness. "They're collapsing the lower levels behind us. They're trying to contain the radiation," Roland shouted, his voice thick with panic. "They're sealing us in," Aria corrected grimly. "They think they can sacrifice the core and the lower tiers to save the executive tier. They can't, but they just bought us a few minutes of clear air." She forced them on, pushing them past the point of exhaustion. The airlock was close now, a heavy, semicircular arch set into the sheer man-made granite wall of the outer boundary. M19. Outer seal hatch. Decommissioned. Aria recognized the archaic, manually operated wheel lock. She slammed her data slate into the old, manual control box, which was miraculously still receiving a trickle of residual power. Access code, Sigma Theta 94. She had committed the decommission code to memory years ago, an idle curiosity that was now their final prayer. The screen flickered green. Authorization accepted. The heavy metal grinding sound of the archaic machinery powering up was deafening in the silence. The hatch groaned, the seals cracked, and the inner vault door slowly, agonizingly began to move. The elderly man slumped against the wall in sheer relief, weeping. "It's open. Get inside now," Aria ordered. They scrambled into the antechamber. Aria was the last one, her body trembling with exhaustion and the lingering shock of grief. She sealed the inner door behind them, manually locking the shear bolts. The antechamber was tiny, smelling strongly of ozone and deep earth. Aria moved to the control panel of the outer seal, her hands steady despite the tremor running through her core. Activating pressure equalization cycle. The last energy reserves of HAVEN9 surged into the airlock pumps. The metal walls of the chamber groaned under the strain. Roland stepped next to Aria, his eyes wide. "Engineer Lorne, what's out there? What do we do when that door opens?" Aria pressed the final activation sequence. "You listen to me, Roland. The world out there is not the city. It is not logic and schedules. It is instinct and survival. When this door opens, we run. We find cover. We find water. We will not be engineers anymore. We will be animals." The pressure equalization stopped with a sharp hiss. The outer seal hatch was ready to open. Aria looked at Lyra, who stood braced against the wall, her eyes fixed on the final door. Aria reached out, her hand finding Lyra's. The connection was physical, a jolt of familial love and shared terror. A final, bone-jarring boom sounded from the main city deep behind them, the sound of the core's final collapse. The tunnel they had just traversed was sealing shut forever. Aria took a deep, shuddering breath. The air in the chamber was already changing, mixing with something foreign, something clean. She slammed her hand down on the override eject button. The outer hatch exploded open, not with a mechanical whir but with a sudden, violent burst of force, the seals breaking free. A massive, overwhelming gush of fresh, clean air slammed into the antechamber, carrying with it 1,000 smells none of them had ever known. The sharp tang of pine, the damp, rich scent of wet earth, and something indescribably sweet, like flowers. And then, the light. Breakthrough, sunlight, and the new world. The light was not the harsh, filtered yellow of the city lamps, nor the emergency red of the alarms. It was blinding, golden, unfiltered sunlight. It poured in through the gaping maw of the hatch, a waterfall of dazzling intensity, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the chamber. It was so intense that every single person, after a lifetime spent in the gloom, had to shield their eyes. Aria stepped forward first, her utility lamp instantly useless against the sheer, radiant power of the natural world. She pushed the hatch wider and stepped out onto the moss-covered, deeply cracked lip of the city's outer boundary wall. She stood on the precipice of a ravine. Below her, a lush, impossibly green world stretched out. It was not the sterile, ash-scarred wasteland of the old world's warnings. It was a riot of color, a dense, thriving forest that climbed up the steep, rocky slopes, swallowing the ancient, crumbling infrastructure of the world that had been destroyed 2 centuries ago. The sound of running water, a powerful river, was a deep, cleansing roar. A sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion finally crashed over Aria, not grief, but a stunning, exhilarating mix of awe, fear, and profound vindication. The Council of Preservation had been wrong. They had lived their lives in a tomb, clinging to the ghost of safety, when life had already returned and healed the world above. Lyra stumbled out next, pushing her respirator mask off her face. She looked at the towering trees, the vibrant, wet moss, the sheer, unimaginable expanse of the blue sky high above the ravine. She screamed, not in fear, but in pure, cathartic joy. The green. Aria, the book was right. It's real. It's all real, Lyra cried, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and wonder. Roland and the others spilled out behind them, their faces upturned to the sky, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of this impossible, beautiful reality. Aria looked down at her hands, still clutching the data slate. The light exposed the flaws in her skin, the dust, the tremor in her fingers. She was a small, dust-covered figure standing against the monumental, healing force of nature. She was no longer the engineer of Haveen 9. She was simply Aria Lorne, a survivor, standing on the edge of the world. A deep, powerful sense of leadership settled over her. She had seen the truth, and she had brought people to the light. The journey was done. The new one was just beginning. She had survived the machine. Now she had to survive the wild. Aria took her first true breath of unfiltered, living air in her life. It tasted of clean rain, pine needles, and the immense, terrifying space of the sky. "We made it," she whispered, her voice husky. Then, with the practiced efficiency of a leader, she turned to the group, pointing across the ravine. "This way. We need cover before the light shifts. Roland, you take point. Stay low. We are surface-born now. We learn to hunt." Chapter 3. The New Earth. The escape from Haven 9 had been a symphony of metal and fire, but the surface was a world of deafening, vibrant life. Aria found herself navigating not by the familiar glow of emergency lighting, but by the relentless, shifting shadows cast by the colossal, forgotten structures that now lay draped in foliage. The ravine where the outer seal hatch had opened was steep and treacherous, a gorge carved by the powerful river below. Aria led the group down the slope with the same ruthless efficiency she used to track a coolant leak. She found handholds in the exposed, crumbling concrete, now softened by centuries of rain and root growth, and ensured everyone moved with quiet, deliberate steps. The initial awe that had swept over Lyra and the others quickly curdled into stark terror. The air was not just fresh, it was thick with unknown sounds, the buzz of insects the size of a thumb, the rustle of massive, unbroken foliage, and the distant territorial roar of an animal they couldn't identify. The vastness of the sky, once a symbol of hope in Lyra's book, was now a terrifying, limitless void. "We follow the river," Aria whispered, her voice barely audible over the rush of the water. "It means clean water and a known direction. Stay in the thickest cover." Roland, the hydraulics man, was their physical shield, broad-shouldered and grim, placing himself at the rear. The young systems analyst and his wife, clinging to their infant, moved with frantic, clumsy movements, their fear broadcasting louder than any alarm. The elderly couple struggled with every step. Aria, however, felt a strange, chilling sense of calm. The underground had been a series of solvable equations leading to a terminal answer. The surface was a new, complex problem set, and her mind immediately began dissecting the variables: shelter, food, defense. Her dark hair was now plastered to her head with sweat and grime, and her striking blue eyes, so used to the flat plane of a data screen, were constantly scanning the three-dimensional chaotic landscape. She was small, but every muscle in her petite, determined body was coiled with readiness. She was beautiful, yes, but her beauty here was functional, a testament to her hard-won survival, not a decorative trait. They followed the riverbank for hours. The sun tracked its slow, deliberate path across the wide sky, filling Aria with a sense of dizzying temporal shift. In Haven 9, time was measured by the city's internal clock and shift schedules. Here, it was measured by the movement of a celestial body they had only known as a simulation. A dangerous rest. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet, a spectacle that made Lyra gasp despite their danger, Aria ordered a halt. They had found a shallow, dry overhang beneath the roots of a colossal ancient tree that had grown around a skeletal remnant of a pre-collapsed skyscraper. It offered temporary shelter and a clear view of the river. Aria immediately set about the work. She located suitable stones and, using the flint and steel from her satchel, carefully, silently coaxed a small, smokeless fire, shielded deep beneath the overhang. She taught them to use the water purification tablets and apportioned the meager supply of compressed food bars. The fire provided the first moment of collective peace since they had left the maintenance shaft, a flickering symbol of defiance against the surrounding night. This is what they meant by survival, Roland muttered, staring at the flames, his face a mask of shock and wonder. Aria took the moment of stillness to run a check on the group. The young mother, exhausted, was finally asleep, the infant held tight to her chest. The elderly couple were weak but present. Lyra was staring into the woods, her jaw tight. "You need rest," Aria told her sister, resting a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "I keep waiting for the city to turn the lights back on," Lyra admitted quietly. "It doesn't feel real. It feels like a beautiful trap." "Then we will find the way out of the trap," Aria promised. She had no time for fear, only strategy. "We rest in shifts. Roland, you take the first. I will take the second." Aria sat by the weak fire, her mind still operating in overdrive. She reviewed her own resources: 2 food bars, half a liter of water, a multi-tool, a signal flare, and the useless but symbolically important data slate. She had nothing resembling a weapon, nothing against the things that roared in the night. It was this profound, tactical vulnerability that was the most unsettling. She could fix a collapsing reactor, but she couldn't outrun a predator. As she watched the flickering shadows, a profound loneliness descended. The loss of Mara was an aching emptiness, and the burden of these 7 lives weighed on her like the granite dome of Haven 9. She missed the simple certainty of her equations. She watched the night, a vast, organic darkness punctuated by the chirps and calls of the new world. It was in this moment of quiet, focused observation that the terrifying beauty of the surface truly revealed its indifference. The world did not care that they had survived. It only cared that they were weak. Ambush. The attack came not from the forest, but from the river. Aria was in the middle of her shift, the moon, full and huge, a silent silver eye, high overhead. The air was cold, the fire was reduced to embers, and the group was finally in deep, fragile sleep. The sound that snapped her alert was not natural. It was a rhythmic, calculated movement, paddles dipping silently into the river current, approaching their blind side. She moved instantly, placing herself between the sleepers and the riverbank, dropping into a crouch. Her hand went to the grip of her multi-tool, a ridiculous defense against what was coming. She saw them emerging from the gloom, 3 sleek, low-slung vessels carved from dark wood. They were manned by large, powerfully built figures, cloaked in dark hides, armed with long, wickedly barbed spears. These were not the gentle, civilized survivors of Lyra's journal. These were predators. A figure in the lead boat raised a hand, giving a silent, chilling signal. "Too late," Aria shouted, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence. "Run! The trees! Get out of here!" But the shock was too great. The young mother screamed, freezing the group. The figures from the boats were instantly on the bank, moving with a terrifying speed and coordination. They were tall, scarred, and wore the symbols of barbarism: rough leather, etched armor, and a palpable air of cruelty. They were the Varrock tribe. A spear slammed into the rock right next to Aria's head, the shaft quivering violently. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lyra, pulling her sister toward the cover of the dense roots. Roland roared, attempting to intercept the nearest attacker, a massive mistake. The Varrock warrior simply sidestepped his clumsy charge and brought the butt of his spear down on Roland's head. Roland collapsed, silent and still. The ambush was over in moments. It wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. The Varrock warriors quickly subdued the scattered, terrified survivors, binding their hands and feet with thick, coiled rope. Aria and Lyra were caught in the dense root system, yanked out roughly by two grim-faced men. A warrior, whose face was bisected by an old burn scar, barked an order in a harsh, guttural dialect Aria couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Move. The captive and the glimmer of attraction. The Varrock camp was situated in a desolate, rocky area miles inland, chosen for its defensible, natural crags and proximity to a secondary water source. It was a place of rough hides, perpetual smoke, and the heavy, grim atmosphere of constant vigilance. Aria, Lyra, and the remaining survivors were thrown into a rough, open-air cage constructed of thorny branches and thick leather cords. Their initial shock had given way to cold despair. It was here that Aria noticed him. He wasn't part of their group of captured HAVEN-9 survivors. He was their only other prisoner. He was shackled to a massive, upright slab of granite near the center of the camp, positioned where he could be perpetually watched, perpetually exposed. He was a monumental study in endurance. Ronan Vance. He was easily the most imposing male Aria had ever seen. Broad-shouldered, tall, and carved from hard muscle and unforgiving lines, he was a man built for the rigors of this brutal landscape. His chest and arms were crisscrossed with old silvered scars, the markings of a veteran warrior. He wore only rough trousers, and his exposed back was a tapestry of whip marks and fresh bruises. His dark, close-cropped hair was matted with sweat and dust. He looked less like a prisoner and more like a captured force of nature. Aria watched him as the Varrock warriors casually circled their new captives, jeering. Ronan, despite his brutal position, didn't react. He stood utterly stoic, his head slightly bowed, projecting an aura of immense contained danger that seemed to keep the warriors at a distance even while he was chained. Aria was preoccupied with Lyra, who was huddled, weeping silently. But her engineer's mind, accustomed to processing all data inputs, registered every detail of Ronan. She noted the unusual, complex pattern of his scars, the way his chains were secured, hastily, almost carelessly, suggesting his captors were overconfident in the strength of the iron, not his will, and most compellingly, the intense, restless intelligence that simmered in his eyes, even when they were downcast. After what felt like hours, one of the Varrock warriors, Scarface, the one who had thrown the spear, approached Ronan and delivered a hard, unnecessary kick to his ribs. Ronan didn't flinch. He didn't even make a sound. He simply raised his head, and his eyes, dark, intense, and utterly cold, flicked up to Scarface. It was a look of such concentrated menace that the Varrock warrior actually took a half-step back, his bravado momentarily shattered. It was then, in that fleeting moment of focused intensity, that Ronan's gaze swept over the new captives, settling on Aria. A subtle jolt, a genuine physical shift, went through Aria. It wasn't fear, nor was it pity. It was a raw, biological acknowledgement of equal measure. Ronan's eyes lingered on her small, determined face, on the grime covering her cheeks, the fierce intelligence burning in her blue eyes that refused to look away, and the subtle, protective way her body was positioned in front of her sister. He saw the engineering precision of her posture, the lack of collapse. In that brief, heavy exchange of gazes, amidst the filth and despair of the barbarian camp, there was a subtle spark of attraction. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was a primal, intuitive recognition of uncommon strength. He saw a mind that was still working, still calculating escape. She saw a warrior who had been defeated but not broken, a powerful resource waiting to be unleashed. Ronan gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning, a signal to be silent, to stay alert. Aria understood immediately. She closed her lips, forcing the questions back, and lowered her head, feigning defeat. Survival lessons and cunning, days blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear, hunger, and cold. The Varrock were savage, but they were also disorganized. Their leadership was based on brute force, not strategy. They ate poorly, maintained poor hygiene, and spent their days either drunk on fermented fruit mash or engaged in petty, violent squabbles. Aria, still pretending to be crushed by despair, began her relentless process of data acquisition. She watched how they organized their shifts, poorly. She noted where they stored their water, vulnerable. She monitored the strength of the thorny cage, breakable with sustained effort and the right leverage. She observed Ronan. Ronan remained silent, chained to the rock. The Varrock ignored him for the most part, only occasionally taunting him. But he was watching everything too. His dark eyes tracked the sun, the guard's routes, and the weaknesses in their perimeter. Aria began her survival training under the Varrock's oblivious gaze, teaching Lyra and the others quietly, through coded language. Lyra, the water tastes sharp today. Translation: the Varrock are drinking from the main reservoir. It's a vulnerable supply line. Roland: the structure of that watchtower seems unbalanced, doesn't it? Translation: look at the weak point in the central camp's defense. Focus on the leverage. She also began communicating with Ronan. It was almost imperceptible. When the Varrock were preoccupied with their midday meal, Aria would use the motion of scratching an insect bite near her ankles to clear away a small patch of dust on the ground. One afternoon, she scratched the number 3 in the dust, the number of active, armed guards. Ronan, pretending to stretch his neck, scanned the ground. When his eyes returned to Aria, they narrowed almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the data point. Later, a Varrock warrior threw Ronan a piece of dried meat. Ronan, after tearing a piece off, tossed the rest carelessly near the base of the rock. As he did so, his shoulders shifted. Aria saw the subtle movement. He was indicating a secondary Varrock patrol route along the ridgeline. Aria swallowed, the fear tightening her chest. But the thrill of the silent, coordinated work with Ronan was a strange, energizing counterpoint to the despair. This was a partnership born of pure, mutually respected, strategic intelligence. One evening, Scarface approached the cage, his teeth flashing in the firelight. He roughly pulled the young mother out, demanding she clean a cooking spit. The mother, terrified, began to sob. Aria spoke up instantly, her voice clear and level, masking the terror that threatened to paralyze her. She is useless for labor. She is weak. She will simply break your tools. I am stronger. I have engineering knowledge. I will clean your tools better. I will show you how to maintain your blades for longer. The warrior paused, surprised by the unexpected audacity from the small, slight woman with the bright eyes. He saw the logic in the offer. A compliant worker was better than a sobbing liability. He dragged Aria out of the cage instead. Aria walked past Ronan, her heart hammering. As she did, she deliberately brushed her hand against the rough granite slab where he was chained. She didn't speak, but her piercing blue eyes locked with his dark, watchful gaze. Stay alert, his eyes commanded. Don't break. I won't, her eyes returned. I'm working on the data. It was a connection based on the fundamental calculus of survival, an intimacy forged in shared, extreme danger. Ronan's warning. The warrior had Aria cleaning his spearheads, demanding she sharpen them on a crude stone. She worked with deliberate, focused movements, pretending to be meek while absorbing every detail of the Varrock's tools, materials, and routines. The warrior eventually left her, distracted by a round of drinking. Aria seized the moment. She moved quickly, silently, toward Ronan's position. The campfire was dying down, and the Varrock were loud, drunk, and distracted. She knelt near the massive slab of granite, pretending to examine a broken blade on the ground. Tell me your name, engineer. Ronan's voice was a low, guttural rumble, unused to speech but commanding. Aria Lorne. I am from Haven 9. We are 7 survivors. My sister Lyra is in the cage. My name is Ronan Vance. He paused, his head still bowed, looking completely defeated. You've been counting. Your captors are undisciplined. Their supply chain is vulnerable. They are preparing for a raid, judging by the sharpening of the blades and the increased consumption of fermented mash. Where is the raid? Ronan let out a harsh, silent breath that might have been amusement. He raised his head, his dark eyes cutting into the gloom. You're calculating the angle of their retreat, aren't you? That's not how the surface works, Aria. You can't engineer an escape. I can engineer anything. I just need the variables. Ronan looked at her, his gaze intense. In the dying light, he didn't look like a captive. He looked like a king in exile. The unmistakable power of his presence, even chained, was overwhelming. The variables are simple. They don't let things go. They don't just kill captives. They trade them, or they sacrifice them to the mountain spirits to ensure victory on the raid. You and your people are not prisoners of war. You are a resource exchange. Aria felt a chill deeper than the night air. Who are they trading us to? Ronan paused, his eyes sweeping the camp, ensuring no one was near enough to hear their low whispers. They are raiding my people, the Skard. They took me months ago. They plan to use you as bait to lure the Skard away from their winter stores, or as a peace offering to one of the smaller rival tribes they are attempting to absorb. Aria absorbed the information instantly. Ronan was not just a captive. He was a valuable hostage, the former leader of a rival tribe. The Varrock's careless confidence in chaining him meant they had already neutralized his political power, or believed they had. And your people? The Skard. If we escape, will they help us? The Skard are hunters and warriors. They are wary of outsiders, especially surface-born, who smell of metal and decay. You survived the collapse of your world, Aria, but you will not survive my world without a guide. He shifted his weight, and the chains rattled faintly. They will move you at dawn, before the raid begins. The one with the scar, Marek, he will guard the transport. He is ruthless, but slow-witted. If you intend to engineer your escape, you must do it when they are at their most arrogant, when they believe the iron has solved their problem. He was telling her everything, quickly and efficiently, trusting her ability to process and act on the data. It was the purest form of partnership she had ever known. His brutality was a weapon, and he was offering it to her as a tactical advantage. The subtle attraction she felt was no longer about his sheer physical power. It was about the shared language of strategy. The way his warrior's mind mapped danger was perfectly symmetrical to the way her engineer's mind mapped failure. "Thank you, Ronan Vance," Aria whispered, her voice a promise. She looked at the chains around his wrists. "I will not leave you here." Ronan looked at her small, determined figure, at the unwavering intensity in her blue eyes. A small, grim smile, the first sign of humanity she had seen on his face, touched his lips and vanished. "I am counting on it, engineer. The Varrock will pay a heavy price for breaking the Skard. And you will lead the way." Aria gathered the broken blade and returned to the shadows, her mind racing. Dawn was hours away. She had the variables. Now, she had to write the algorithm for their escape and revelation. The new world was dangerous, but she finally had an ally, a ruthless, capable guide whose motivations aligned perfectly with her own. Survival, the only thing that mattered, was finally back on the table. Chapter 4. Escape and Revelation. The pre-dawn hours of the Varrock camp were thick with the smell of stale fire, fear, and the metallic tang of impending conflict. Aria had not slept. She sat against the rough wall of the cage, her mind a high-speed calculator, running the escape plan Ronan had helped her map in their silent shared language. The plan was audacious, relying entirely on the Varrock's arrogance and preoccupation. As the first bruised light of the sun began to filter through the trees, the camp stirred. The warriors were preparing for their raid on the Skard. They were loud, careless, and focused on the glory they hoped to achieve, paying almost no attention to the huddled, defeated captives. Aria saw Marek, the scar-faced guard Ronan had warned her about, approaching the cage with 3 other warriors. They carried crude, heavy yokes and thick, painful-looking ropes. "Up, metal rats," Marek barked, kicking the cage. "Time for your journey to the mountain. You are a gift for the spirits, or maybe a good, soft distraction for the Skard." The younger mother began to weep uncontrollably, clutching her infant tight. Aria, her petite body trembling with controlled adrenaline, moved to the front of the cage. "We will walk peacefully," Aria said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, despite the fear making her throat tight. "But the elderly couple cannot handle that yoke. Their breath is weak. If they fall, you will lose them, and your offering will be incomplete." Marek laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "The weak feed the wolves, engineer. You worry about your own neck. I worry about your purpose," Aria countered, relying on pure, cold logic to cut through his machismo. "A complete tribute is stronger magic than a broken one. Let me guide them. I will ensure they keep pace." Marek, obsessed with the idea of a, quote, tribute and eager to be rid of the annoying, weeping prisoners, unexpectedly agreed, simply tying a tightrope around Aria's waist, linked to the main column of captives. He was confident that her slight figure offered no threat. The captives were led out, a miserable procession. As they passed the central granite slab, Aria felt Ronan's presence like a physical force. Ronan stood still, his chains ringing softly as the Varrock detachment secured a yoke around his neck, an unnecessary gesture, given the massive iron cuffs still anchoring him to the rock. He looked right at Aria. His dark, intense eyes conveyed only one word: now. Aria moved her hand to the knot, securing the rope at her waist. It was a crude, thick knot, but Aria was an engineer. She knew knots. More importantly, she knew rope tension and friction. "Stop!" she yelled, just as Marek turned to lead the group away from Ronan. Marek spun back, spear raised. "What now, rat?" "The rope on the old man's yoke," Aria lied, pointing a shaking finger. "It's chafing his neck. It will draw blood." "Bad luck before a raid," Marek cursed, angered by the interruption. He stomped over to inspect the yoke, momentarily turning his back on Ronan and focusing his fury on the elderly captive. That was the distraction. Aria didn't hesitate. Using the knowledge Ronan had signaled, the hasty, careless setting of the cuff bolt, she snapped the wire she had carefully stripped from her data slate hours earlier. She lunged low, feigning a trip, and simultaneously used the wire to short-circuit the residual magnetic lock in Ronan's iron wrist cuff. The small click was swallowed by the chaos of the busy camp, but Ronan felt it. Ronan's chains were still looped around his body, and the yoke was still heavy on his neck. But the crucial pin of the wrist cuff, the one anchoring him to the granite, was free. As Merrick turned back, cursing, Ronan moved. It wasn't a visible movement, it was a sudden, controlled explosion of force. With a visceral, primal roar that silenced the entire camp, Ronan ripped the massive yoke and the remaining heavy chain loops from his body. The sound of shattering iron and tearing wood was deafening. He slammed the granite slab with his free, shackled wrist, wrenching the main iron cuff off the rock, taking a large chunk of the granite with it. He was still wearing the chains, hundreds of pounds of iron, but he was unleashed. The nearest Varrock warriors were paralyzed by the sheer, unexpected violence of the act. Ronan didn't waste a moment on glory. He slammed the massive, chain-covered granite piece into the nearest guard, crushing him instantly. The chaos was instantaneous. "Run, Aria," Ronan roared, his voice a tidal wave of command. Aria didn't argue. She had already solved the knot at her waist. She grabbed Lyra and dragged her towards the northern ridge. The direction Ronan's subtle signals had indicated was the least guarded path. The escape was a frenzy of noise and blood. Ronan, using the sheer weight of his broken shackles as a terrifying weapon, fought with a brutal, focused efficiency. He didn't just fight. He was systematically disabling the camp's command structure. Merrick, recovering from his shock, charged Ronan, spearing him in the left thigh. Ronan didn't even flinch. He used the long, heavy chain wrapped around his arm to snare Merrick's spear, yanking it out of his hands, and then driving the length of the chain into Merrick's face. Aria looked back once, seeing Ronan, a silhouette of terrifying chain-clad power, buying them time with sheer, relentless violence. The sight sent a wave of adrenaline and fierce loyalty through her. This man hadn't just escaped, he had earned his freedom and theirs. She hauled Lyra and the remaining 4 survivors up the steep, root-laced ridgeline, scrambling on hands and knees, ignoring the desperate cries of the Varrock warriors who finally began their chase. Survival training, the harsh wilderness. The first 2 days of their freedom were a blur of desperate flight. Aria, Lyra, and Ronan were utterly alone. The other survivors, terrified and slow, had scattered into the woods shortly after they left the Varrock camp, a harsh but necessary shedding of non-essential weight. Ronan, dragging the massive, cumbersome chain still attached to his wrist cuff, led them with an unblinking primal instinct. He moved through the terrain as if he had been born from the soil and rock, silent and efficient, despite the gaping, bleeding wound in his thigh. Aria, still operating under the twin engines of grief and adrenaline, was constantly mapping their escape, looking for water sources, and treating Ronan's wound with the antiseptic paste from her small satchel. The friction between them was instantaneous and fierce. It was the clash of 2 equally powerful but fundamentally opposed systems of thought, logic versus instinct. They stopped briefly on the 3rd night, hidden deep in a labyrinthine cave system Ronan knew. The first few words of their partnership were not tender. They were a territorial clash. "You're leaving a trace," Aria accused, pointing to the obvious deep gouges the chain was making in the soft earth. "They will track you within the hour." Ronan was busy trying to secure the chain, wrapping it around his arm to lift some of the weight. His face was a mask of pain and exhaustion, but his dark eyes flashed with offense. "I was running the perimeter of their territory. I am guiding us, engineer, not measuring the friction coefficient of my bindings. Your logic is slow. If we stop to analyze every rock, the Skard will find their own way to deal with the Varrock before we reach them. If we don't use logic, we die from stupidity," Aria retorted, kneeling to study the chain links. Her small, neat hands were smeared with dirt and Ronan's blood. "I can remove that cuff, but I need fire, high heat, and a sustained strike point. The alloy is too strong for the multi-tool." Ronan watched her, leaning back against the cold stone, the raw, visceral pain of his wound momentarily forgotten in the face of her relentless practicality. He admired the fierce, unyielding blue of her gaze and the simple, functional beauty of her precision. Most people would be weeping or praying. She was diagnosing his shackles. "You can't. It's scarred iron. It's older than your city, but if you can keep the wound clean, it will do. It won't do. It will slow you down, and it will eventually become infected. I saw your movement at the camp. You were extraordinary, but now you're a liability, and I don't carry liabilities." The blunt, ruthless assessment stunned him. He was a war chief. He was used to deference, not cold, clinical criticism. "You have courage, little engineer," he growled, the subtle stirrings of attraction deepening beneath the hostility. He was drawn to her lack of fear, her intellectual arrogance. "But you hide your fear behind equations. My body is a weapon, I understand. Your knowledge is a paper shield here." Aria met his challenge with equal intensity. "And your instinct is a blunt hammer. It got you captured, Ronan. My logic got us out. We survive only if we fuse the equation and the hammer." Ronan stared at her, a reluctant spark of respect igniting in his eyes. She was right. He had relied on strength. She had relied on calculated chaos. "Tell me what you need, Engineer Lorne," he conceded, the honor code of a true leader recognizing a valid strategy. "I need a clean, flat striking surface, a sustained, high-temperature fire, and something dense and heavy to strike with. And a better antiseptic." "The paste is running low," Ronan pointed with his chin. "That rock you're sitting on is granite. Perfect anvil. Firewood is dry. The Skard alloy needs 2 sun cycles to cool after shaping. You'll need to hit it hard, quickly, when the metal is hot." He was testing her, giving her the tactical knowledge, watching to see if the delicate curve of her brow would furrow in panic. It didn't. It tightened in concentration. "Then we hunt," Aria declared, rising to her feet, her petite figure vibrating with determination. "You will teach Lyra to find the antiseptic herbs you use, and you will teach me how to move silently. I won't be caught again." Seeds of romance, shared firelight and quiet care. The next 2 days established their partnership. Ronan was a relentless, patient teacher of the wild. He taught Aria to move through the thick underbrush like wind, to read the territorial markings of the surface tribes, and to track water sources by the slope of the moss. Aria, in turn, became his relentless, patient healer. She found the herbs Ronan directed her to, a bitter-smelling paste that stanched the bleeding and reduced the swelling in his thigh. But her true victory came on the 3rd night. Using a fire built deep inside their hidden cave, Aria managed to superheat the iron chain at its weakest, most stressed link. She used a heavy, flat stone as the anvil, and Lyra's heavy, leather boot heel as a makeshift buffer, striking the link with the heaviest stone she could lift. The work was brutal. Aria's small muscles screamed with effort. The heat was scorching, and the blinding flash of the glowing metal made her eyes water. Ronan watched her, completely silent, his pain forgotten, entirely focused on the intensity of her struggle. With one final, desperate, crushing blow, the link snapped, the sound a sharp, clear crack of freedom. The chain fell with a heavy, final thud onto the stone floor. Ronan sat up instantly, flexing the newly free wrist. He looked at the discarded chains, the symbols of his capture, then at Aria, who was slumped over, breathing heavily, her face blackened with soot but shining with the elation of victory. "You were right," Ronan admitted, his voice low and husky, a sound that resonated deep in the chest. "Logic always wins, if the variable is correctly identified." Aria met his gaze, utterly exhausted but victorious. "I told you. I don't carry liabilities. Now, you led faster." That night, something shifted between them. They were sitting by the small fire, the last of the dry wood sputtering out. Lyra was asleep, wrapped in the comforting thickness of her salvaged wool blanket. Ronan looked at Aria, noticing details she hadn't allowed him to see before. The delicate, perfect line of her jaw as she studied the embers, the way her ice-blue eyes held a quiet sadness when she thought she wasn't being watched. "You never weep, Engineer," Ronan observed, his tone stripped of its aggressive edge, now laced with a raw curiosity. Aria looked up, surprised by the intimacy of the question. "Weeping is a waste of energy. It changes nothing. It changes the soul. You lost your mother in the tunnels. I saw the aftermath. You sealed it away, like a broken conduit." Aria felt a flash of sudden, fierce anger, the intrusion into the private vault of her grief. "My emotions are my own. They are not a factor in our survival." "Everything is a factor in survival," Ronan countered gently. He reached out, his large, scarred hand moving slowly, deliberately, and gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. The touch, rough and unexpectedly warm, sent a powerful current through Aria. It wasn't sexual, it was acknowledgement, a recognition of her humanity, not her function. It cracked the engineered wall of her grief just enough to allow a sudden, powerful wave of loneliness to wash over her. "I was supposed to save her," Aria whispered, the raw confession torn from her. "I planned the escape for months. I knew the danger. I was supposed to be faster. But the collapse was random. It wasn't logical." "The surface teaches you that life is random, Aria," Ronan said, his voice quiet, drawing her gaze. "Your city tried to stop the randomness, but that is why your city died. Mara died because she was in the way of the rock. You survived because you were not. You cannot engineer away chance. You must learn to ride it." He didn't offer comfort or pity. He offered perspective, the warrior's acceptance of fate. It was the only language Aria's logic-driven heart could truly understand. Aria stared at him, the depth of her trust in this silent, scarred warrior deepening tenfold. She didn't trust his heart, but she trusted his truth. The atmosphere in the cave thickened, charged with the profound silence of two people who had just shared their deepest, most painful truth. The attraction between them, initially sparked by strategic respect, now deepened into a mutual admiration of unbreakable spirit. Ronan saw the tenderness beneath her steel. Aria saw the honor beneath his brutality. The path to the Skard. The next morning, they moved faster. Ronan, free of the chains, moved with the effortless grace of a true predator, a stark contrast to Aria's calculated efficiency. The speed of their travel was now relentless. Ronan paused only once, pointing to a distant, barely visible peak in the mountain range. That is Skard territory. 3 days' march. We must move in silence now. This is a contested border. We are no longer simply escaping. We are entering a territory of war. Aria nodded, already calculating the terrain, the food supplies, and their diminished water reserves. As they began their final push, they moved side by side. Aria, focusing on the ground, spotted a barely visible, intricate carving on a flat river stone, a symbol of a bird with a stylized wing. "What is this?" she asked, pointing. "A Skard boundary marker," Ronan explained, his voice low. "It tells all travelers. This land is taken, and we are watching. It is a sign of warning and of protection." Aria examined the carving, touching the cold stone. "It's beautiful, more beautiful than any electronic warning sign." Ronan looked at her, then back at the symbol. "We don't value what is easy, engineer. We value what lasts." The stone lasts. He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew they were talking about more than just stone markers. They were talking about the brutal, enduring nature of the surface, a nature that demanded strength, strategy, and a relentless focus on survival. The tribe of the Skard. The final leg of the journey was an ascent into the harsh, clear air of the mountain peaks. Aria and Ronan moved with the focused silence of experienced hunters. Ronan, no longer burdened by the chains, led with a seamless, effortless grace that spoke of years spent navigating this unforgiving terrain. Aria walked beside him, her exhaustion masked by the relentless concentration of a person who knew she was entering the most dangerous territory yet, civilization. Lyra, clinging to the optimism that Aria's presence fostered, walked slightly behind them, scanning the ancient carved rock faces. The other surviving HAVEN-9 citizens, Roland, the hydraulics man, Alara and Tyrus, the young systems analyst and his wife, with their infant son Kale, and the elderly couple, Mina and Silas, had separated from them early in the escape, a practical necessity in the chase, and Aria held little hope they had survived the brutal weeks in the contested borderlands. Their focus was now entirely on the immediate future. The boundary marker Ronan had shown Aria days ago, multiplied into a series of intricate, symbolic carvings: the hawk, the leaping stag, the crossed spears. These were not just warnings. They were statements of identity and dominance. "We are close," Ronan finally stated, his voice a low rumble, blending into the mountain wind. He stopped, his broad shoulders squared against a sheer cliff face. "We approach with caution. I have been gone for 2 cycles. My authority may be challenged." Aria nodded, her blue eyes absorbing every detail of his tension. She knew this was the true risk, not the Varrock, but the political battlefield. "You said you were the former leader," Aria reminded him. "Do you expect an assassination attempt, or just a debate on resource allocation?" Ronan glanced at her, a flicker of appreciation for her pragmatism crossing his scarred face. "Both. My brother, Kieran, took command when I was captured. He believes strength is measured only by the sword. He will see you as a weakness. A soft piece of the dying world I dragged here." Aria merely adjusted the strap of her salvaged satchel. "Then I will prove my value is greater than a sword." They were challenged moments later by a patrol of 3 Skard warriors, clad in thick, fur-lined hides, and carrying long, formidable axes. Their faces were painted with tribal markings, and their suspicion was immediate and fierce. The warriors recognized Ronan instantly. Their initial shock gave way to wary deference, but their gazes lingered on Aria, the outsider, the brunette woman wearing the dust and torn scraps of the underground. Ronan spoke in a rapid, complex dialect that Aria couldn't follow, but the tone was absolute authority. He introduced Aria simply as the engineer, the one who broke the Varrock's chain, and Lyra as her blood, the witness. They were led into the Skard encampment, a sprawling settlement nestled in a natural caldera, sheltered from the wind. It was a place of organized, hard-won survival, huts carved into the rock, smoking racks of preserved meat, and a constant low buzz of activity. The camp immediately fell silent. Every eye was on Ronan, but just as quickly, every gaze shifted to Aria. A figure detached himself from the main gathering, a man only slightly less imposing than Ronan, with sharper, colder features, and a heavy, silver-worked axe strapped to his back. Kieran, Ronan's brother. The reunion was a study in hostility. No embrace, no warmth. Just 2 powerful men, circling each other, the air between them thick with unspoken accusations and challenges. "Brother," Kieran greeted, his voice possessing a metallic resonance that lacked Ronan's natural depth. We mourned you, the Varak boasted of your cage. They were wrong to boast, Ronan countered, his stance defiant. He gestured to Aria. This is the engineer who freed herself and me. We survived by her strategy. Kieran's eyes raked over Aria, lingering on the dust and the worn skin. She looks soft. The surface is not kind to softness, Ronan. We need leaders who understand the knife, not the cipher. She understands the failure of the knife, Aria interjected, stepping forward before Ronan could object. She held her head high, meeting Kieran's dismissive stare with the full force of her piercing blue eyes. The Varak are predictable. That is why Ronan and I are here, and your raiding party is 3 days late to the border. Kieran bristled, enraged by the audacity of the outsider speaking. You trespass on a matter of blood, underground rat. I trespass on a matter of logic. Aria corrected, folding her arms. Your tribe relies on 3 separate water pools. If the Varak were smart, they would poison the lower 2, and force you into a drought before the snow falls. Have you checked the lower filtration beds today? The question was a direct hit. Kieran had been too preoccupied with consolidating power and preparing for a punitive raid to attend to boring, necessary maintenance. A nervous tremor went through the surrounding warriors. Water security was life itself. Ronan watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and alarm. Aria had played her most valuable card immediately, irrefutable, technical foresight. She had exposed Kieran's neglect. You will be tested, engineer, Kieran sneered, regaining his composure. If your logic fails, you will pay the price for disrupting the Skard. I will be tested, Aria agreed. And if my logic succeeds, then the Skard will owe me the right to stay, and the authority to speak. Aria and Lyra were assigned a small, rough-hewn dwelling, carved into the lowest tier of the caldera, a place of minimal regard. Aria immediately set to work. She knew integration was a matter of utility, not friendship. Her first task was the water supply. She inspected the filter beds Kieran had neglected. Using the principles of fluid dynamics and her knowledge of metallurgy and purifying agents, she identified 3 key flaws: microfissures in the primary stone reservoir, calcification in the runoff trenches, and an imbalance in the natural filtering agents. Over the next week, Aria worked non-stop. She directed the laborers, who regarded her with silent, open suspicion, to use local mosses and crushed river stones to rebalance the filtration system. She taught them to use a natural resin to seal the reservoir cracks. Within 4 days, the water flow increased by 15%, and the taste, even to the Skard, was noticeably cleaner. She moved next to the food stores. She applied her expertise in preservation and logistics, designing a cold storage system deep within the rock that leveraged natural air currents, a system far more efficient than their traditional smoking racks, reducing spoilage by half. Aria wasn't just fixing things, she was introducing efficiency, a concept the honor-bound warrior culture dismissed, but one that directly translated to survival and strength through resource hoarding. The Skard warriors, initially dismissive, began to develop a grudging respect. They saw the results: cleaner water, less sickness, more food for the coming winter. Aria wasn't physically strong, but her intellectual strength was a tangible weapon. Lyra, meanwhile, found her own gentle path to integration. Her innocent wonder and lack of fear charmed the tribe's children, and she began to teach them the old songs from her salvaged book, The Stories of the World Before the Ash. Ronan, navigating the delicate political dance with Kieran, used Aria's successes as leverage. Her logic provides us strength, brother. You were hoarding. She teaches us to thrive, Ronan argued during a tense council meeting. It was after a long day repairing an air vent that drew smoke from the main communal fire that the nature of Aria and Ronan's relationship shifted definitively from strategic partnership to intimacy. Aria was exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, sitting alone near the dying communal fire, studying a crude tribal map Ronan had given her. Ronan found her there. He didn't speak, just sat down across from her, his powerful body settling easily on the rough ground. He carried a small water skin, which he offered to her silently. Kieran is mobilizing the younger warriors to clean the southern pass, Aria noted, drinking the cool water. He's trying to show he can organize manpower too. It's useless work, but politically necessary. You see everything, Ronan said, his voice quiet. He didn't compliment her, he acknowledged her mind. I have to. If I miss a variable, we die. You are safe here, Aria, for now. You have bought our safety with water and meat. You can let the tension drop. Aria looked at the fire, the orange light softening the sharp angles of Ronan's face, tracing the lines of his scars. I can't. I lost my mother because I assumed the structure would hold. I won't lose Lyra because I assumed the tribe would hold. Ronan leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding her gaze. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Stronger than any warrior. You carry the death of your world, yet you still build. He reached out, his hand, large, rough, and powerful, cupping her face gently. The gesture was tender, yet possessing the absolute certainty of a man who takes what he wants, but takes it with respect. The contact was an uncontrollable surge. Aria didn't flinch or pull away. She leaned into the heat and the reality of his skin, letting the tension she had carried for weeks finally begin to melt. Ronan was the only person who had seen her at her most broken, grief-stricken after Mara's death, and at her most determined, snapping his chains. He accepted the totality of her. "We are not just strategy, Aria," Ronan murmured, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "We are blood and bone. We are life." Aria closed her eyes, letting go of the control she had maintained for so long. She reached up, her hand finding the rough, strong curve of his neck. "Show me," she breathed. The kiss was not soft. It was fierce, necessary, and grounding. It was the raw hunger of two people who had faced death and chosen life. A life shared, a life of heat and reality. It was a release of strategic tension, a profound declaration that in this savage new world, they were each other's primary source of strength. Their relationship became a fundamental element of their shared survival, a fierce, protective intimacy forged in the darkness of the cave and deepened by the warmth of the Skard fire. Their bond was overtly sexual and rooted in the profound trust that only comes from mutual danger. In a world where touch and vulnerability were high-risk exposures, their physical connection was an act of affirmation and release. This intimacy happened in the quiet shelter of Aria's rough dwelling. It was a merging of their opposing forces. Ronan, all primal strength and overwhelming tenderness, worshipping her resilience and intelligence. Aria, shedding her engineer's emotional armor, embracing the raw, unfiltered reality of human desire. Their physical connection was marked by absolute trust and honesty. There was no hiding grief, no feigning strength. Ronan never sought to dominate, but to partner. His touch acknowledged her as his equal, a fellow survivor. For both the high-strung engineer and the perpetually vigilant warrior, their shared physical moments were the only true respite from the constant strain of command and survival. It was a necessary reset, ensuring their focus remained sharp when the dawn broke. This physical relationship solidified their position against Kiran, marking them not just as political allies, but as fated mates in the eyes of the more traditional Skard. Days turned into weeks. Aria integrated fully, not by shedding her old identity, but by applying it to the new one. She wasn't just fixing things, she was adapting their civilization. She even began to teach Lyra and some of the Skard youth to read the old data slate, using the light of the fire to illuminate the schematics of the defunct underground world. A subtle way of showing that the knowledge of the past was useful for the future. Ronan, backed by Aria's successful reforms, solidified his authority. Kiran still bristled, but he could not argue with full water barrels and healthier children. One evening, Ronan found Aria by the water filters, her hands stained with resin, her face thoughtful. "You are Skard now, Aria," Ronan stated, placing a heavy, fur-lined cloak around her shoulders, a gift and a political statement of acceptance. "You belong here." Aria leaned into the warmth of the fur, and the greater warmth of the man beside her. "I belong where my mind can be useful, Ronan. You need to prepare for the Varrock counter-raid. They will not forget their humiliation." She looked up at him, her blue eyes shining with focused purpose. "We cannot simply fight them with axes. We have to fight them with engineering. I will build defenses they won't expect." Ronan looked out over the caldera, then back at the powerful, intelligent woman who was his partner. He saw not a soft surface dweller, but the architect of his people's future. "Tell me your plan, engineer," Ronan commanded, his voice filled with respect and deep affection. "We will build your traps." Chapter 6. The New Dawn. The shadow of the Varrock counter-raid fell over the Skard caldera like a shroud, but in Aria, it ignited a brilliant, cold fire of focused energy. The time for escape, for grief, and for tentative intimacy was over. Now only strategy mattered. Aria had earned her right to command not through blood or brute force, but through the irrefutable truth of superior planning. The fate of the Skard rested on the mind of the woman who had once managed the failing life support systems of a dead city. The communal fire had died down to embers, leaving only the silver light of the moon on the rugged stone. Aria stood with Ronan, outlining her defense plan on a flat slab of shale, tracing lines with a piece of charcoal. "They will attack through the lower gorge," Aria asserted, tapping a narrow, winding line at the base of the mountain. Her voice was low and firm, possessing the absolute authority of a definitive equation. "Kiran's patrols are predictable. They check the high passes every 6 hours. The gorge is their blind spot, the fastest ascent, and the path with the best cover. Their arrogance will dictate the approach." Ronan, stripped down to a simple leather vest, his powerful body a sculpture of sinew and scars in the pale light, watched her, his dark, intense eyes fixed on the line she drew, not the charcoal itself. He was accustomed to battle plans of maneuver and frontal assault. Aria's plan was about traps, redirection, and resource depletion. We ambushed them on the ridge, Ronan countered, echoing the traditional Skard approach. Meet their strength with ours. No, Aria countered instantly, shaking her head. We meet their strength with friction. We don't sacrifice our warriors in a frontal assault. We make the environment fight them before they ever reach our gates. We bleed their time, their water, and their focus. By the time they arrive, they will be broken, not merely wounded. Aria pointed to 3 specific areas on the shale map, 3 narrow choke points in the lower gorge. Here, here, and here. We need to implement 3 primary obstacles. She detailed her design. 1. The rock slide trigger, point alpha. Utilizing the unstable rock face directly above the first choke point, Aria instructed them to strategically chip away at the base structure. The goal wasn't to cause a natural collapse, but to create a hair-trigger seismic point. Ronan, I need a long, taut cable, metal if possible, or tightly twisted fiber, running from the trigger stone all the way back to the camp. Lyra and I will monitor the gorge with a rudimentary mirror relay system we can build, using polished metal scraps. When the Varrock mass below, we simply pull the trigger. They will be trapped and slowed. 2. The water diversion, point beta. Further up the gorge, Aria identified a crucial hidden stream that fed into a naturally enclosed pool, the only guaranteed water source in the gorge. We divert this stream. We dig trenches above the pool, creating a bypass that leads the water into the dry, porous earth below. Then, we seed the dry bed of the pool with crushed caustic mosses, the kind we use for dye and tanning. The Varrock will be desperate for water. They will find the empty pool. They will dig. They will find moisture, but it will be poisoned and corrosive. It will blind and madden them. 3. The funnel barrier, point gamma. At the final choke point, just before the ascent to the caldera, Aria rejected Kieran's suggestion of a wooden barricade. They will burn wood. We use layered heavy stone and reinforce it with the thick, thorny vine from the shadow forest. It must be high enough to force them into a single-file breach. But the true weapon is above. We create a series of simple, weighted catapults, tension and leverage, Ronan, loaded with quicklime and tar. When they are funneled, we rain hell down on their formation. Ronan absorbed the tactical shift, the move from immediate, glorious combat to delayed, strategic attrition. It was the most brutally efficient plan he had ever encountered. It was the absolute opposite of the Skard's warrior code, yet it was irrefutably logical. You do not fight, Aria, Ronan murmured, stepping closer, his voice low with deep admiration. You engineer their defeat. I do not waste resources, Aria replied, folding the map. The Varrock are a known variable. Their cruelty is predictable. My defenses are not. They will commit to the assault, and by the time they realize the trap, retreat will be impossible. Over the next 2 days, Aria took command of the tribe's labor force. She directed the women, the children, and the elderly in tasks that required patience and precision, tasks Kieran's warriors had always dismissed as soft work. She organized the digging of the diversion trenches, oversaw the difficult process of rigging the rock slide cable, and tirelessly worked with Lyra to construct the primitive yet effective mirror communication system. Kieran watched from a distance, simmering with resentment. He saw his authority slipping, not to his brother's strength, but to an outsider's intellect. She teaches our people to hide and to cheat, Ronan, Kieran challenged one morning. We are warriors. We face our enemies. We are survivors, Kieran, Ronan retorted, strapping on the thick leather armor Aria had helped him reinforce with scavenged metal plates. And she teaches us how to survive a war we cannot afford to lose. You lead the warriors who will defend the perimeter, but you obey the engineer's commands. The command was final. Ronan had fully committed to Aria's system. The night before the expected Varrock arrival, a strange, nervous calm settled over the camp. Aria was exhausted, her hands raw and blistered from managing the rope tension and digging the trenches. She found Ronan waiting for her in her small, quiet dwelling. He didn't speak. He simply took her hands, examining the damaged skin with a tenderness that still surprised her. The rock slide is ready. The water is diverted. The catapults are loaded, Aria summarized, her voice hoarse. Now we wait. Ronan looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of pride and a heavy, protective desire. He saw the grime on her face, the fatigue in the muscles of her neck, and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. This brunette woman was the reason his people would live. You have done the work of 10 warriors, Aria, Ronan whispered, lifting her hands to his lips and pressing a soft, reverent kiss to her raw knuckles. I have done the work of 1 engineer, she corrected, a slight weary smile touching her lips. Engineering is simply applied logistics. It is the most powerful weapon. Ronan released her hands and pulled her close, resting her cheek against the solid, warm wall of his chest. The smell of earth, leather, and Ronan's own primal scent was utterly grounding. In this moment, they were not commander and engineer, they were two souls facing the abyss of war, seeking certainty in each other. "You said you do not waste energy on weeping," Ronan murmured, his voice rumbling against her ear. "But tonight, there is no escape. Only surrender. Surrender the fear, Aria. Surrender the calculation. Let the life flow." He guided her face up, kissing her with a deep, consuming urgency that spoke of both the imminent danger and the fierce, unshakable trust they shared. Their intimacy was not a gentle solace. It was a consuming fire, a necessary act of life in the face of death. Ronan treated her with a devotion that acknowledged her strength, not despite it. He knew she was not fragile. He worshipped the steel core beneath her skin, the brilliant, strategic mind that had secured their survival. When they were together, Aria could finally let the years of control drop away. Ronan's hands were rough but unerringly gentle, moving over her skin, finding the core of her tension and releasing it in explosive bursts of sensation. She found a profound satisfaction in his strength, in the reality of his muscled body pressing against hers, a tangible affirmation of life and power. Their coupling was a declaration of intent. To survive, to endure, to build a future together. It was fierce, passionate, and brutally honest, stripped of the pretense of the old world. Ronan's thrusts were deep and rhythmic, driving out the fear, replacing it with the singular, focused reality of their shared existence. Aria cried out, not in pain, but in release. The full, desperate catharsis of the engineer finally letting go of the controls, allowing the current of life, guided by the immense protective strength of the warrior, to sweep her away. Afterward, they lay entwined, the silence between them heavy with the scent of sex and sweat, the promise of battle outside their small chamber. Aria felt the familiar weight of Ronan's arm across her stomach, not a chain, but an anchor. "We survive this," Aria stated, tracing the line of a new scar on his shoulder with her finger. "We thrive, engineer," Ronan corrected, pulling her closer, his voice rough with spent passion and renewed resolve. "You have taught me the difference. We will make the Skard thrive." The air was still, cold, and heavy with mist when the mirror relay signaled the first movement in the lower gorge. The Varak were coming. Ronan kissed Aria once, hard and possessively, before pulling on his gear. "Stay with Lyra and the elders. Monitor the line," he commanded. "Do not move from the watchpoint." Aria returned the fierce kiss, her blue eyes burning with focus. "Go, and let your arrogance be the logic of my trap." Ronan took command of the 40 best warriors, melting into the shadows of the upper caldera defenses, leaving Kiran in charge of the primary gate defense, a necessary political deployment. Aria, positioned at the concealed watchpoint with Lyra, watched the gorge through the mirror system. The Varak war party was large, led by Merrick, the scar-faced warrior, emboldened by a quick victory over a small, outlying hunting party. They moved with the overconfidence Ronan had predicted, following the easiest, most direct path, straight into the first choke point. Lyra, terrified but steady, held the cable taut. Aria gave the signal. Now. Lyra pulled the fiber cable with all her strength. The sound was not a grand explosion, but a sickening, guttural grind, as the strategically weakened rock face collapsed. Tons of granite and shale slid down the narrow gorge, trapping the Varak vanguard against the cliff, and effectively blocking the only path for retreat or reinforcement. Screams echoed up the gorge, not the sound of battle, but the sound of crushing weight and panic. The main Varak force, cut off from their vanguard, began to struggle through the debris, their advance slowed to a crawl, their cohesion shattered. Hours later, the remaining Varak, desperate and parched, reached the second choke point, the empty pool. Aria watched as they immediately descended into the dry bed, digging frantically for moisture, only to recoil moments later, shrieking as the caustic mosses reacted with their sweat and dirt, burning their eyes and skin. The poison wasn't lethal, but the blindness and madness were tactically devastating. Finally, the remnants of the Varak force, exhausted, desperate, and half-blind, stumbled into the final choke point, the funnel barrier. They were broken and disorganized, forced into a tight, struggling line, exactly as Aria had calculated. Ronan, watching from his position above, saw the true beauty of Aria's engineering. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter of logistics. At Ronan's command, the Skard warriors triggered the quicklime catapults. The concentrated powder and sticky tar rained down, further blinding and immobilizing the trapped Varak. The final charge, led by Ronan and his warriors, was not a hard-won victory. It was a cleanup. The fight lasted less than 15 minutes. The Varak force was utterly annihilated, their arrogance having paved the way for their ruin. When Ronan returned to the caldera, he walked directly to Aria. His armor was stained with blood, but his eyes were clear, bright, and utterly focused on the woman who had delivered the victory. He didn't speak the traditional warrior's greeting. He simply knelt before her, wiping the grime from her cheek with his thumb. "The Skard live because of the engineer's strength," Ronan declared, his voice ringing across the silent, watching tribe. He stood, pulling Aria to her feet. "She is not a guest. She is not a resource. She is the architect of the Skard, and she will lead us beside me, for all the cycles to come." Kirin, seeing the undeniable proof of Aria's power and the devotion in his brother's eyes, finally bowed his head in reluctant acceptance. Aria looked out over the caldera, the clean water flowing, the strong defenses built, the people safe. She had lost her world of cold, predictable steel, but she had saved these people with the same fierce, unwavering logic. She had found a new, vital purpose, and a love as strong and unyielding as the mountains themselves, built on respect, strategy, and shared, raw survival. Her future was no longer in the past, it was here, on the surface, beside the warrior who finally understood the true power of an engineer's heart. Aria and Ronan have secured their future on the surface, having proven that the engineer's logic is just as powerful as the warrior's blade. Their story of Haven 9's fall and the rise of the Skard is a testament to the fact that even after the world ends, life and love will always find a way to begin anew. If you loved Aria and Ronan's journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic stories like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me, what was your favorite chapter?